Unemployment, yeah, and I'm going to leave it off today. I wanted to kind of make a special effort of it last time to make sure you got it there, but unemployment and this one are related. How? More people to do it, right. So we have that positive relationship between employment and economic growth, or the negative relationship of unemployment and economic growth, right? So let's just, for this time, add a note, because it's an important note. Unemployment, I'll phrase it that way, but we can go either way. Unemployment is negatively correlated with output. Output goes up, unemployment goes down. Output goes down, unemployment goes up. So by having, the point with this is by the Fed following an output stabilization policy, it's kind of one and the same as they're following an employment strategy or an unemployment stabilization. Okay, so we captured this in the aggregate demand, and now I want to pick up where we left off last time to kind of complete that, and then we'll summarize the three once again. So we had our number 3. This is kind of continued from last time. What do we have? A permanent supply shock, and it's a negative permanent supply shock. Negative permanent supply shock. So get good at drawing your long run equilibrium. Yes. So there's our kind of home base, long run equilibrium. A permanent supply shock shifts both long run and short run aggregate supply, and kind of the initial shift we can think of as, graph it appropriately. We can think of long run aggregate supply shifting to the left, so a decrease in our resource base somehow. And then the aggregate supply curve at that target level of inflation, you can draw the AS2. Now we're already starting to get quite a few intersection points, right? It's starting to get confusing. So one thing to do is start off with maybe a big dot where your initial long run equilibrium was, and I'll just kind of follow the way your textbook's been doing it by just putting a 1 there. So we start there, and the current state of the economy is always given to us by the short run aggregate supply curve and the aggregate demand curve. That would be 2. And last time we discussed, we can always eyeball where we're going in the long run with a hands-off approach, a laissez-faire approach. Where is the economy going in the long run? Supply, which supply? The original demand, yeah, because that hasn't changed on us. And the second long run aggregate supply curve, right? So that's where your eye should gravitate with a kind of a hands-off approach. Prices are going to adjust, resource prices are going to continue to adjust, and there's going to be upward pressure moving to point 3. So how we defined that last time is we called it our activist approach and non-activist approach. If we were to put some labels on the non-activist approach, what camp would these fall in? What kind of economists did we call them last time? Hayek, Mises, so that's called the kind of the Austrian school, right? So that was our handout that we had on Austrian. And then the classical, Friedman, we can put other labels like neoclassical, and I mean there's other labels that have come around, but that's kind of this non-activist approach for the most part. Okay, so the non-activist approach, we would have the decrease in long-run aggregate supply and short-run aggregate supply, the policy shock here. Let's just put those two things together. They kind of both, boom, go to their level. Leads to a short-run decrease in output. So our output level is now less than potential. Might be a recession. Recession is defined a little bit differently in that it's a 2-quarter decline of real GDP. So we might kind of eyeball this and say recession, but this is really a kind of a snapshot in time of a prediction of where we're going. But we do sometimes call this a recessionary gap. But for sure, output is below our long-run potential. And that's the key. So what's happening to unemployment? Unemployment's going up, right? So real GDP is falling, unemployment's going up, and here is our point 2. So with the non-activists, we get a movement to point 2, let's just call it. That captures some of that. And then in the long run, prices continue to adjust, and the adjustment is an increase. So we're going to continue to see inflation by further decreases in aggregate supply, moving us to this point 3, which I'll do with maybe a dash line. Well, maybe I won't even dash it here. So AS3. And now the economy's back to a long-run equilibrium. Notice we've got the red, the blue, and the original aggregate demand curve all intersecting at the new level of output and the higher inflation rate. So let's just call this pi 3, and I'll just call it y3 down here. Is this situation going on in the economy kind of good, kind of bad? It's going to be what it is.
You had a drop in output.
Drop in output, bad. Unemployment, up. Inflation, up. Suck, 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 right? This is all bad. This is really bad news heading this direction. So you can kind of see the bad news when we destroy our resource base. It leads to some bad results, right? Land, labor, capital, entrepreneurship, technology, whatever. We got this thing that economists call stagnation. We have inflation along with stagnation, so we call it stagflation altogether. Kind of both a double whammy. So this is kind of a suck area in econ. So let's put on here, notice the suckiness. Notice the suckiness. We got an increase in inflation and a decrease in output and an increase in unemployment. Suck, 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 suck. Across the board. Okay. Activist point. Any questions or comments there? Activists. What might be the activist approach to this problem? decrease interest rates. Now, if we decrease interest rates, what's the impact on that? So a decrease in the interest rates. Raise, not the supply. So if the Federal Reserve pursues lowering interest rate, it'll raise the demand. That's an expansionary monetary policy. So let's just golf club that one out. Let me just go up to here. Does that help us out?
No, our inflation is a lot higher.
Inflation's going to go a lot higher. Why do you say kind of?
Because our output's back at its original level, but you lost a lot because of it.
Okay, so we got high inflation, output comes out to here. Does it stay here in the long run? No, that's the point, right? So in the long run, we're going right back to here. And so Friedman said that inflation is anywhere and everywhere a monetary phenomenon. So if we cannot inflate our way out of this, eventually the free market is going to get us back to this new permanent long-run aggregate supply area. So that trigger isn't probably a good one in this case. Is there any policy that leaves us in a better situation compared to the non-activist approach? Yeah, and that's something that's not one of the policy, but you're right, that's what our real problem is could we find something that would actually move real resources this way? But is there any one of the three here? Well, let's just narrow it down to two is what we're really doing. These two move together. So inflation targeting or output stabilization. Is there anything the Fed could do here that would be better than maybe the non-activist approach? Remember, we're basically starting from point 2. We were at point 1. We moved to point 2, which, by the way, point 2 all by itself is suck, 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 right? We were just moving to a higher level of suck, suck, suck at point 3. So what might the Fed be able to do to reduce a little bit of the suck? It sounds bizarre. Decrease the supply. That they don't have direct control over, because that's on the supply stuff is really more of the market-driven stuff, because we have resource prices and we have the basic quantity of resources and technology. Does anybody see something? There's one thing here that could be, and it's kind of almost counterintuitive. Yeah. 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 So just the opposite of what you did. You sent it up here, but an argument could be made that if we tighten up the economy, we can bring us back to here. Now that still feels like a suck situation because we're reducing output from where we were. So the big question of the day is, how tight do we think this is the new potential for the economy, right? And so you're absolutely right. We can, through policy, take a path through contractionary monetary policy to bring us down to this point 3. And that point 3 brings us back to our target level of inflation. Output is still down, but output was going to be down anyway. So that would be one way to use policy to get us back to here through inflation targeting. This is one of the justifications that the Federal Reserve uses for inflation targeting. That, hey, we know that this is, if we just kind of watch our target, then if it's a supply curve shock, we're not going to be any worse off. We're going to be moving the right direction in the face of a negative long run or a permanent supply shock through a policy of inflation targeting. If we had a policy of output stabilization, we would follow Reno's suggestion, because that is the right response. Output goes down, then I'm going to bump it up, right? I'm going to try to stimulate the economy. That wouldn't be the conventional wisdom, though, if it's a permanent shock, because we've got this down here. Okay, so let's write the activist approach here. So with the activist approach, Fed let's see, we want to decrease money supply to jack up interest rates and decrease aggregate demand, which moves the economy to 0.3, orange 3. Let's see, how about if we do 3 prime? I have it in colors here, but you guys with your pencils could just put 3 prime. Move the economy to 0.3 prime, where we are restoring our target. So we're back to pi t. And we also got back to our potential. So we were able to stabilize price pressure upwards.
I thought that we were still lower GDP.
Well, there's a new potential. What this really is a P on it.
Okay.
Yeah, because when long run, that is the potential for the economy. Yep. Okay, anything else there? All right, so I want to come back to the temporary supply shock and tie in more of this output versus inflation targeting as the policy choice. So let's just kind of say, this is kind of plays off of the other example. Should Fed follow inflation target or output stabilization with temporary supply shock? Question mark. So start off with our home base.
Is that negative or positive?
Negative. All of these have been thinking about recession responses so far that we talked a little bit about before. So, same one we did the first time we did it earlier this week. So if it's a temporary supply shock, what moves? Yeah, aggregate supply, and it heads in the negative, the kind of the suck direction to AS2. Inflation starts to climb, and output falls. Oops. Non-activist approach, what happens? Supply falls back, yep, and we get back to potential. Good. So we're always, remember, going aggregate demand, long-run aggregate supply. That means this is going to come back. Now, activist approach following a inflation policy. Activist approach following an inflation policy.
Decrease supplies.
They don't impact supply.
Or demand, sorry.
Right. So increase interest rates, the same one we just did. So that's why I kind of tied this one in here. If the Fed follows an inflation targeting policy, then they would start to take action to bring inflation down. And what does that do to output? It makes it worse, right? So that is highlighting some of the trade-offs that are going on with an inflation targeting policy. We kept inflation in check, but may have caused the economy to get worse compared to letting the non-activist approach of just letting the economy fall back.
Is that supply still gonna come back down, and then when we get back to potential, it'll be lower than we were before?
Right, right, yep. So from here, if we pull the aggregate demand down through the contractionary policy and then we leave things go, you're right, we're going to even see more deflation ultimately. There'll continue to be this downward pressure on prices. Okay, so if the Fed pursues output stabilization policy with the temporary negative supply shock. So let me put the 2 up here because here's where we were, here's where we went to. If it pursues output stabilization, what does it do? It lowers interest rates, right? So now we're going to just start chugging up this way. And this is the one we already did when we did this last time, right? We showed that that was going to be inflationary. In the long run, we're all dead. So Keynes said maybe we're okay getting up to here. If the target rate of inflation is in the 2 to 3% zone, and this is 2%, and this ends up being 2.5%, maybe that's okay, right? We had that discussion about depending on where we're at. So either way, the Fed is in a bit of a trap because they can't win. They can't win in the sense of fulfilling both 1 and 2 when we have a negative temporary shock. And kind of the moral of the story. If they drive us to 3 or 3 prime, I guess the way I did it. Okay, so let me put that conclusion down. So, should the Fed follow pi t or output stabilization with temporary shock? That's kind of a loaded question. Depends on level of inflation and target range. During the Paul Volcker era in the 1970s, this was starting to get up to 10% inflation, right? We were getting real uncomfortable at the how much inflation was being shot up. And so the appropriate policy measure at that time was to contract the economy, drive it into a deeper recession, and then look for better days. So that's kind of the depends answer on the level of inflation. So depends, Fed can't achieve both increase in output and a decrease in inflation with negative temporary shock, supply shock. And just to, I guess, further that, decreasing inflation leads to a decrease in output. An increase in output leads to an increase in inflation. So the Fed can't win, no matter what policy they're following.
So they'd be better off not creating a policy to do it, or is it just going to be?
No, if this is 2%, and this is 3% or whatever, 2.5%, and we have a target range that we think is acceptable of 2 to 3%, then I'd say go ahead and inflate, right? If we're acceptable to that level. But if instead this is 3% and it pushes us up to 5% outside of our range, then it might not be the right policy to do. Okay, so it kind of depends on that target range of where we're at. Okay, good question. Anything else? All right. So the Keynesians probably take the most heat from the lag time it takes to see things happen in the economy. Which one has less lag time, monetary policy or fiscal policy? Less lag time. Fiscal?
No.
Less lag time.
Neither.
So, let's start off with what's lag time.
How long it takes for a policy decision to take the desired
To
effect.
take the desired effect. Good. So you implement the policy and it takes effect a day later, a week later, 3 months later, a year later, 2 years later. The longer that time frame from policy implementation to effect is the lag time of the policy. And there are all sorts of lags to think about that economists have identified. And ultimately, economists try to measure these lags through econometrics. So we got 5 types of lag. 5 types of lag to be weary of. So first of all, lag time is the time between the start of change to the result of its desired outcome. Lag time is the time between the start of change to the result of its desired outcome. And in macroeconomics, our first one we're going to look at is a data lag. Does anybody remember how long it takes them to figure out their first estimate of GDP? Our first real number when the government releases what gross domestic product was?
3 or 6 months.
6, yeah, 6 months. So it's 6 months after the fact. So in other words, what they're estimating today happened 6 months ago. They're like, oh yeah, well way back in April or whatever. So there's this data lag. So time to get macro data. Some data comes quicker. That's one of the reasons we use the CPI. The CPI is calculated monthly. They send out little government workers out to Walmart and Price Chopper, and they shop for tomato soup and green beans, and they see what the prices change by. And so we get monthly data on the consumer price index. So inflation data tends to come through the CPI much more quickly than real GDP. Number 2, recognition lag. So this is the time it takes policy makers to recognize changes in the economy. A little different than data lag, but data is just, we can't calculate the data that quick. Recognition lag is the time it takes from them to say, to get everybody on board, oh crap, we have a problem. Maybe one economist starts to put together a few puzzle pieces. They take it to their weekly meeting, right? They take it to the press, then the Wall Street Journal gets it in the runs or whatever. Some sort of recognition lag, and depending on the case, maybe longer or shorter. So recognizing that we have a problem in the first place. No. So legislative lag. And these kind of go in line with their name. So this is just the time it takes to pass a new policy measure. Time it takes to pass new policy. This is the one where the Federal Reserve has the upper hand on Congress. So with Congress, we're running through session, get it passed, maybe 6 months to 12 months later, we have a new law that says we have cash for clunkers. And so you can go turn in your used car and we'll pay you, the federal government will give you $2,500 or whatever. All right, so the Federal Reserve, on the other hand, is meeting frequently, the FOMC meetings that we learned about, and they have a lot quicker or lots smaller legislative lag. Number 4, implementation. This is kind of lags under a microscope. Implementation lag. So this is the time it takes policymakers to implement the change they decided on. So the Federal Reserve has their meeting in the morning and they say, let's raise interest rates. Does uttering those words raise interest rates? What needs to be done? What did we learn about the process for the Fed actually changing those interest rates?
Mess with the, I can't remember the name of it, the discount rate and the interest on reserve.
Okay, yep, interest on reserve. So those are a couple of the rates that they could go in and change. And then even if they do those, it takes a while to get word out to the actual bankers that are out there and them to change their books, reprogram their computers so that they're getting the right interest rates and make those adjustments, right? So all of that takes a little bit of time. The Federal Reserve, if they're going to do an open market purchase or sale of bonds, they have to actually wait for the market to open, call up the person at the New York Fed at the desk, put those changes. Remember, they run out to they fish out orders to all the brokers that are members of their system. They say, hey, give us bids on bonds. Those bids come back in. That day they're putting into place. That's all implementation lag. The time it takes to actually, once the decision's made, the time it takes to actually get that into place. And then finally is the effectiveness lag. And this is the time that it takes effect. So, time for policy to have full effect. I don't think there's an economist out there that would say we are at the point with now quantitative easing falling that we've seen all of the effects from the Fed doing that. We might still be a year, maybe even 2 years. They got into long-term stuff. They got into mortgage-backed securities. They kind of put their fingers out into stuff and changed contracts in a material way. Like if you had a commercial lease that you were doing, it's common that you'd have an inflation adjustment that might be fixed. There might be an interest rate adjustment on a loan that has a 5-year balloon or something. So Americans, businesses, and individuals made long-term contracts. Those long-term rates, for the first time in history really, were impacted by the Fed's quantitative easing and buying the mortgage-backed securities, kind of artificially suppressing those rates down. So we have yet to figure out what that is going to be exactly for the economy. All right, questions on those? More lags than you thought we'd ever think about. I love this quote. I might have even attempted it with you guys once before, but I did a little Google search and I was lucky to find it. I tried it one other time, but I couldn't find it. So Alan Blinder served on the Council of Economic Advisors. He's written principles textbooks, and I thought this went to Friedman, but I very well might be wrong. They didn't seem to quote it, so this might be all these guys. These guys are pretty heavy hitters. They said that this fiscal policy, the perception of sometimes even our leaders like the President Obama or other people, that we can steer the economy like a race car, right? I turn it to the right, it goes to the right. I turn it to the left, it goes to the right. And what Baumel and Blinder said it's more like a poor rifleman shooting through a dense fog. At an erratically with an inaccurate gun. And slow-moving bullets.
You're not going to kill anything.
Yeah, they really laid it out thick, and I always remembered I think I learned this in graduate school at some point. One of my professors said this, and I remembered the dense fog and the moving target, but this is the whole thing, yeah. A poor rifleman, somebody who's not so good, shooting through a dense fog at an erratically moving target. All right, so our erratically moving target's the economy. Our gun is some of the policy tools that we're using that aren't so accurate. We don't know what the multiplier effect is. You know, we can estimate it, and economists attempt to do that. But at the end of the day, they'd probably all claim, because evidence shows it's pretty inaccurate. It's an inaccurate gun. It's not the best gun in the world. Slow-moving bullets. That is all, I think, a little bit of a comment on the difficulties economists face. Now, Blinder tends to be more of a Keynesian. So despite his words, he still thinks that the activist measures would be better, is what Blinder would argue.
You should still shoot anyway.
Yeah,
regardless of how hard.
Right. Well, let's still shooting should be better than not shooting, I guess. And so from what we put together on our sheets with the 3 types of shocks, we did make an argument that maybe activist policy in some cases was preferable maybe to the non-activist account. So let's kind of do a little summary conclusion of the 3 cases. So number one, if shocks to the economy are mostly aggregate demand and permanent supply shocks, then policy that stabilizes inflation will also stabilize economic activity. Even in the short run. And that's what we found by analyzing those trade-offs. Now, if temporary shocks, temporary supply shocks, dominate, then Fed must choose the lesser of two evils. All right, so the last little wrap up here for this is to just show what can happen with these two policy targets. So we have two cases, one called demand pull inflation, and the other one is cost push inflation. And these we did in Principles Class 2. So for each one, just draw our home base. This won't take very long. It just kind of shows a summary point of how we can get ourselves into trouble like we did in the 70s. And there's a lot of fogginess on what economists might think the potential level of real GDP is. So with this model, we kind of just put it down and we say, there it is. Well, you can ask 100 economists and you'll get 100 different answers potentially on what we think potential is. What we do know is what we're currently observing. So some people, you might think you can almost erase this a little bit. We know here's the current state of the economy, and we know that there's a range. And so if we pursue increases in output, and we have an increase in demand that drives us out to this current level of output, what's the natural state going to be? Where's the economy going to gravitate towards? Right? So always put your eyeball with the new aggregate demand curve in here. Now look at what's going on. If this is the current state of the economy, output's falling, inflation's climbing, help me, I'm falling. This is my version of it. And when we get to here, the Federal Reserve's, don't worry, I'll save the day. Dun, 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 dun. Stimulative policy, right? And so as aggregate supply starts to move this way, they say, I'll save the day. Help me, I'm falling. Don't worry, I'll save the day.
Thanks, government man.
Yeah, thanks, government ma'am. Help me, I'm falling. Don't worry, I'll save the day. And it creates this demand pull. The demand curve is continually, through fiscal or monetary policy, pulling the inflation rate up because we're chasing a dog that don't hunt. We're chasing a output level that's beyond our long-run potential. On the flip side, with cost push, if there is inflation, this is just kind of follows right in line with what we were doing before. The economy starts to expand out to this level 2. We pursue this is the help me, I'm falling. And now we help. It pushes up inflation. Aggregate demand starts to come up. But resource prices are continuously being pushed up. And so we get kind of this, if workers are continuously asking for wages ahead of productivity, and the OPEC oil prices continue to rise, we get this cost push inflation, where the path of the economy follows this, never getting quite back to potential. Okay, we better call it a day. Ooh, ran a little long today. All right, so Monday, remember, we're going to have review for the test. So we're